sky, delivering destruction and death to America's two most important cities. Good evening and welcome to this special one-hour edition of National 9 News on a day that truly shocked the world.
Good evening. All socialite Qantas says it can't rescue Ansett, leaving the airline with few options.
The United States' biggest and most powerful city has been changed forever by a calculated and ruthless attack that left thousands dead and its biggest buildings a pile of smouldering rubble. And in a double blow, the terrorists also targeted the symbol of America's military might. Michael Usher begins our coverage from New York.
America was under attack. New York was the front line, and the World Trade Center, famous twin symbol of American prosperity, was on fire. At 8:45 in the morning, a Boeing 767 speared deep inside the North Tower. It was already crowded with some of the 50,000 people who worked at the complex. 19 minutes later, it became brutally clear this was no accident. The incredible sight of the second passenger jet heading straight into the second tower, setting off a huge explosion. Boom! Oh, man. What's going on? From far below, another cameraman recorded the scene as a man sat unaware of what was happening. The jet was swallowed by the building, then almost emerged on the far side. The most audacious terrorist attack in history was fully underway.
It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
By now, the world was watching as flames took hold. But even then, few expected this was about to become worse, much, much worse. Trapped by flames and smoke, dozens of people hung out from the broken windows, trying to attract help, but many others realised rescue was impossible.
One at a time from different parts of the building, I just started seeing people just drop. And I must have counted like 30 or 40 people, you know.
For all those who somehow kept hope alive and thousands more scrambling to escape down the stairwell, all hope ran out.
Oh my God. We gotta go.
In a horrifying, peeling cascade, all 110 floors of the South Tower came thundering to earth. A doctor recorded the scenes on his camera.
Hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car. It's incredible. Okay, I'm gonna have to go find people who need help. Because I don't think I'm one of them.
Dude, man, the thing's gone. It blew up. I don't know. I came down. I'm alive.
Still around, guys. Still around.
Another cameraman kept recording as a massive dust cloud rolled towards him. Then the shockwave knocking other people to the ground. Everywhere, people running. This reporter telling how a stranger tried to save her from the blast.
Finally, as we ran and ran, he slammed me into a wall and covered my body with his. I could feel his heart beating against my backbone. And I think both of us were sure we were dead.
And then the North Tower, also shaken to its very foundations, could stand no more.
The second one is going down now, as I speak live. The second one is now collapsed down to the ground.
I'm asking you for your life. Get the out of here, please. All right, we got so many people dead. Let's go, please, out of here. I saw it blow and then ran like hell. Thank God. I'm 69, but I can still run. This is now the terrible task at hand, emerging from the dirt and rubble and smoke. The fleets of ambulances, presumably carrying the many, many dead.
Any way possible, rescuers rushed to help. Any transport they could find used to get the injured to hospital. One conservative estimate has up to 2,000 people admitted to hospital, mostly with burns and breathing problems. Also turning up, people answering the appeal to give blood on a scale not seen outside wartime. With both towers gone from the New York skyline, their rubble filled the streets for blocks around the scene. Also on the ground, an engine from one of the jets. Fire engines and other emergency vehicles were pounded by the wreckage. Up to 300 police, firemen and paramedics are thought to be among the dead.
I'm some of the best people in this department. I can't find anybody from 5 rescues and 7 squads, and it's just, it's a devastating thing.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. Do you want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding.
Nightmares. Armageddon right here.
Overshadowed by all this, another outrage an hour later in Washington. A third hijacked passenger jet aimed at the heart of America's military, the Pentagon. The aircraft crashed right through to the central courtyard, killing all 64 on board. 20,000 people work at the Pentagon, and the death toll on the ground is said to be at least 800. Fearing the White House was another target, the Secret Service evacuated all staff except for the government executive and military high command bunkered below the building. A fourth and final hijacked passenger jet remained a menace in the sky, apparently unable to reach its target of the Camp David presidential retreat. It crashed in Woodlands in Pennsylvania. There were no survivors. Another 45 innocent passengers and crew taken to their deaths. Back in New York, the tragic sight of a mortally wounded city, but Lady Liberty standing strong. America will be leaning heavily on her symbols of nationhood, comforting the bereaved, tending the wounded, and looking for justice against such ruthless invaders.
Michael Usher joins us now from New York, where in the early hours of the morning the rescue operation is continuing. Michael, how close are the emergency teams to the worst of the destruction?
Well, they are cautiously moving closer to ground zero, the heart of the destruction. Over the past few hours, we've seen hundreds of tons of heavy machinery being driven into the site. They will slowly start to pick through the ruins. There have been some reports of some survivors underneath all that, using their mobile phones to call family. But so far, no confirmation that any of those people, those poor people, have been pulled out alive. Still, beneath those collapsed towers, the intense fires continue to rage. They simply haven't been able to put them out. And in the past few minutes, a very sombering sight, busloads of exhausted firemen and police and rescue workers that are being driven out, having finished their valiant shifts, their faces covered in dirt and dust, many of them just sitting in silence and staring out the window. So with daylight in just a few short hours here, New York will wake up to a skyline that's been maimed and mutilated by terrorists, and a city that will essentially remain shut down for many days in very much a state of emergency. Back to you.
Thanks, Michael. The world's most powerful nation is still numb with shock and disbelief at the unprecedented attack. As dawn approaches on the morning after, the country's airports and stock market remain closed. The military is on high alert. President Bush has promised that those responsible will be hunted down and punished. Robert Penfold has more.
Americans truly believe that today someone, some group, declared war on them. As they watched the horror of it all unfold before them on television, the country went on a warlike footing.
The worst part about it is there ain't nobody to fight.
With the World Trade Center burning in New York, the Pentagon partly destroyed in the nation's capital, the White House was thought to be the next likely target.
Move everybody across the street.
The president was out of town in Florida, so everyone, except the vice president and his national security team, were told to get out.
I'm told that a plane went into the Pentagon and they're chasing us off the grounds here.
The vice president then headed for a bomb-proof bunker to coordinate a response to the crisis.
Everybody back.
With the continuing threat in Washington, the Secret Service ordered President Bush to stay away from the city. A meeting with school children in Florida was abruptly interrupted, but he was soon trying to reassure a shocked nation.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended.
President Bush was eventually given the all-clear to return to Washington in the late afternoon. His plane shadowed all the way by a group of fighter planes. Soon after, an obviously shocked president appeared on the nation's TV screens.
The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger.
He described the death toll as in the thousands and issued a warning to those responsible for the attacks.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Government buildings all over America have been closed and workers told to stay away until the FBI gives the all clear. Because this attack was so well planned, so secretive, there's no guarantee that the mayhem we've seen today is the end of it. And for the first time in the nation's history, all airports across America were immediately closed. It will be another few hours before any decision is made about when planes will fly again.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
The World Trade Center was seen as the ultimate symbol of America's economic power. Situated close to the world's best-known financial district, Wall Street, there are real fears now about what might happen when the stock market eventually reopens and what effect all this might have on an already shaky US economy.
This is a very serious event. It's economic shocks that come out of the blue that ultimately send us into economic recessions, and this certainly qualifies as a shock of immense proportion.
In another security procedure never before witnessed, senior political leaders were helicoptered to a secret location, while other politicians and their staffs were told to get away from the Capitol building, while fighter planes patrolled overhead. And then police closed off the city of Washington to outsiders. A sense of quiet rage settled over the national capital.
Let's get away from the building, ladies and gentlemen.
It was a feeling echoed across America. It's people now worried about the future, with so many asking, how could this have happened?
I hope they're sending planes over there right now. Take care of business.
Military leaders were brought out as well to do their best to reassure a shell-shocked nation.
But make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
At airports where those hijacked planes were due to land, tragic scenes as emotional relatives realised their loved ones would not be arriving. And finally, in a move to unify a stunned population, a group of politicians from all sides gathered on the steps of Washington's Capitol building tonight. They were there to show their resolve on this, the worst of days.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Robert Penfold is in Los Angeles. Robert, how soon do you think the United States will retaliate for this attack?
Oh, certainly. There's no doubt that once America finds out who did this, retribution will be swift. In the past, we've seen US airstrikes on those who attack America happen within hours. But this attack caught so many by surprise, it will take a while to pinpoint if it was, as so many believe, Osama bin Laden's terrorist group. It's also a huge test for President George Bush. Bush will back the military all the way on this one, and when they find out who did it, he has promised to use all of America's extraordinary military powers to get the terrorists and those who harboured them. Back to you.
Robert Penfold in Los Angeles, thanks. The chilling and cold-blooded acts of terror have put America's airport security under close scrutiny. Questions are being asked about how 4 big passenger jets could be hijacked at the same time in such a well-planned and executed operation. Annalie Taylor has those details.
The doomed flights took off within minutes of each other. At Boston Airport, both American and United Airlines 767s headed for Los Angeles shortly after 7:45 this morning. Fully laden with hundreds of thousands of litres of fuel, the jetliners were about to become flying bombs bound for oblivion. They were joined by 2 other aircraft, a United 757 flight from Newark near New York en route to San Francisco, and a similar American Airlines service on its way to LA from Dulles near Washington. Radar screens picked up the first signs of trouble when the aircraft strayed from their planned flight paths. American Airlines Flight 11, its airspeed suddenly varying wildly, made a dramatic U-turn, and soon after the plane ploughed into the building.
But watch what happened. As the plane entered eastern New York, it turned sharply to the south and headed straight for Manhattan.
At 9:04, there was almost an instant replay as the second 767 followed, this time crashing into the middle of the other skyscraper. But there were still 2 hijacked planes in the air. One of several terrified passengers who managed to make a mobile phone call was Barbara Olson, wife of one of President Bush's most trusted advisors, the Solicitor General. In her final moments alive, she pleaded for help and offered chilling clues about the unfolding mid-air terror.
A woman calling her husband, saying that these hijackers were on board, that they had box cutters, those sorts of knives, and they had herded all of the passengers into the back of the plane.
A third aircraft, American Airlines Flight 77, speared into the Pentagon building. The a symbol of American military might and security, at 9:38. Meanwhile, the fourth plane, a flight from Newark, was headed west as air traffic controllers watched it turn back to the east coast. At 10:20, more than 2 hours after the coordinated attacks began, United Airlines Flight 93 crashed into a rural Pennsylvania field. And it's here that the best evidence yet of what went wrong may well be uncovered. Authorities hope to find the black box recorder containing tapes of cockpit conversations of those last terrifying moments. In the United States, Annalie Taylor, National 9 News.
Prime Minister Howard was in Washington during the Pentagon attack and was rushed to safety at the Australian Embassy. He's pledged to back a lethal response against those responsible and offered his sympathies to all Americans. Nigel Blunden is with him.
John Howard faced the media in Washington only minutes after the first terrorist strike on the World Trade Center towers, and he was clearly shaken.
Could I just say before I start on any domestic things how horrified I am at what I've just heard regarding what's happened in New York.
As the Prime Minister answered questions, an American Airlines Boeing 757 slammed into the Pentagon, America's key military command centre within sight of Mr Howard's hotel.
It appears to be a most horrific, awful event that will obviously entail a very big loss of life. Oh, dreadful, just appalling, awful.
Just 400 metres away, Australian television cameramen were caught up in the chaos at the White House as security was placed on full alert and federal buildings around the Capitol began to be evacuated.
Folks, we need you to clear out this area immediately!
Mr Howard, his wife Jeanette and son Tim were rushed to the safety of a bunker at the Australian Embassy, now under the armed guard of the US Secret Service. The Prime Minister was briefed on the tragic events unfolding around the United States and emerged 3 hours later to read a message he'd sent to the United States President on behalf of the Australian people.
In the face of an attack of this magnitude, words are always inadequate in conveying sympathy and support. You can, however, be assured of Australia's resolute solidarity with the American people at this most tragic time. My personal thoughts and prayers are very much with those left bereaved by these despicable attacks upon the American people and the American nation.
Mr Howard joined the international condemnation of the attacks.
I can only hope, as I know all decent people around the world will, that those responsible for this despicable series of attacks upon the United States will be hunted down and meted out the justice that they so much deserve.
From Washington, the Prime Minister was scheduled to fly to New York tomorrow for talks with United Nations Secretary-General Kofi Annan and a series of meetings with local business leaders. But that program has now been cancelled.
Obviously, in the light of what's happened, it's unlikely that I will complete my program.
And Nigel Blunden is still in Washington with Mr Howard. Nigel, is there any update on the Prime Minister's immediate plans?
It's still a couple of hours before sunrise here in Washington, the US Capitol remaining on high alert, flags stay at half-mast, and the smoke from the Pentagon is clearly visible in the night sky. Our Prime Minister John Howard remains at his safe haven, the Australian Ambassador's residence in Washington. He's there with his wife Jeanette and also son Tim, who's with his parents here in the United States, as well as a couple of other of the key officials from the Prime Minister's party here in the US. At this stage, there's no confirmation as to just when the Prime Minister will return home. He has said through his office that he will stay for at least another day in the United States as finalisations of the actual logistics of getting Mr Howard are worked out, whether that being a commercial airline flight back to Australia or whether Mr Howard will travel home on a government jet sent here from Australia.
Nigel Blunden in Washington. Australians living in New York have told remarkable stories of their escapes from the horror of the attacks. As Cheryl Taylor reports, 15,000 Australians call the city home, with 11,000 more visiting at any one time. Hundreds work in the financial district, many in and around the World Trade Center. Tonight, 50 are still unaccounted for.
When the first plane crashed into the World Trade Center, Australian Adam Hopp was working on the 73rd floor.
I literally thought it was the ceiling.
on the floor above me coming down on top of me, I turned and ran.
Regina Schleider was working on an adjacent building with a 180-degree view of the disaster.
And we could see one of the trade centre buildings engulfed in flames, and part of it was missing. We could see people were jumping or falling out of the building. It was absolute carnage.
Carolyn Rawson, working for an insurance company on the 103rd floor of the World Trade Centre, saw the first plane crash into Tower 1.
And there was a big heat wave, and someone from my team was there, and she said, just let's get out now. And we just ran out, but a lot of people hadn't realised yet what was happening.
That urge to run immediately, her Australian family says, clearly saved her life.
If she had stayed maybe 10 minutes and the second plane had hit, she would have been cut off from getting down to the first floor because the plane would have hit below her floor.
Just 200 metres away from the second tower was Australian fashion designer Richard de Chazal.
The next thing I knew, I think one of the wheels must have come off the plane. It hit somebody standing next to me.
Richard phoned his sister in Sydney to say he was safe, but hit by debris. That news too much for his mother in Queensland.
And he just saw it all happen. And sorry.
Very lucky.
Yeah, very. Extremely lucky.
And as the calls went out for medical assistance, Sydney doctor Jeff Darms jumped on the subway and spent 6 hours at the scene.
Very much like the kind of things you may have seen in pictures of Beirut. The injuries really seem to be at two extremes. There are those who've been killed outright and those who've got relatively mild injuries.
He says he treated at least 30 victims.
They're mostly crush injuries and burns.
Many still don't know the fate of their relatives, and Australian families of known survivors, while thankful, are still reeling.
It's so hard to come to grips with. I mean, when we first heard about it last night, all I could really think of doing is praying, just praying.
Cheryl Taylor, National 9 News.
And the Department of Foreign Affairs has set up a special line for Australians trying to trace loved ones caught up in the terrorist attacks. The number is 1300 555 135. For those Australians who were able to return home from the US today, there was a sense of relief and heartbreak. But airports around the country remain on high alert tonight, with no indication as to when flights to and from America will resume. More from Matt Dowling.
The arrivals and departures boards at airports across Australia merely hinted at the terrorist attack. Passengers en route from the United States only learning of the tragedy when they touched down this morning. They'd been briefed by the captain before many were reunited with family and friends amid heightened security, but most weren't prepared for the full story.
There's been some damage. I don't know how many people have been killed or what.
They're talking tens of thousands, so...
My family works at the Trade Center. I don't know what to do. I can't call. There's no lines going through, so...
They're talking a death toll into the tens of thousands.
Oh, Christ.
That's awful.
Pop star Britney Spears was among the last passengers to arrive from the United States, as was US Open champ Leighton Hewitt. The euphoria of his New York victory replaced by a sense of devastation.
Yeah, and all day yesterday I was sort of travelling around in a car holding the US Open trophy around those streets.
The security measures being enforced at Australia's major airports are similar to those introduced during Operation Desert Storm 10 years ago. They'll remain in place indefinitely, and passengers have been warned to expect some delays. Those delays will be largely due to more baggage checks. Police presence has also been increased. The security crackdown was evident this morning when a United Airlines flight from America bound for Sydney was diverted to Brisbane. A passenger playing a computer game causing a temporary emergency. Meanwhile, a group of Western Bulldogs players holidaying in New York are safe. Nathan Brown phoning home to tell his parents they were okay.
He said he didn't see it, but Das and Craig Ellis saw the people jumping out of the windows.
Matt Dowling, National 9 News.
Like many other American organisations around the world, the US consulate on St Kilda Road was closed today. But Alan Raskell says that didn't stop Melbourne people making their way to the building to pay their respects to those who'd perished.
Flowers for the fallen, tears for the slain. An emotional outpouring of grief outside the US consulate as Melbourne comes to grips with one of the world's worst acts of terror.
It takes a while before you start to realise that so many people. It's awful.
A steady stream of well-wishers made their way to the St Kilda Road building to pay tribute, among them a group from Melbourne Girls Grammar, their youthful innocence forever shattered.
No one's really going to class.
Can't quite understand what's really happened or confused.
All this against a backdrop of tight security, police, including Special Operations Group officers, swarming over the building in search for bombs. Vehicles were also checked, workers told to go home.
I hope everyone's okay. They'll be in our prayers.
Elsewhere in Melbourne, Israeli and Islamic communities were on high alert, fearing reprisals amid speculation over who may be responsible for the US attacks.
I think be aware of the consequences and the danger of tarnishing a whole community as a result of the actions of a few.
We are very, very aware of it, and we are just making sure that we are totally alert.
Victoria Police, as with all other agencies across the nation, are on counter-terrorist alert.
An anti-nuclear protest outside the consulate was also cancelled this morning out of a mark of respect for those who perished in the terrorist attacks. Perhaps a simple message on a bunch of flowers best captured the mood. The world is a sadder place today. God bless. Alan Ruskell, National 9 News.
Australia has pledged to support any American retaliation against those behind the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington. The commitment came from both sides of politics as a security shield was thrown around the US Embassy in Canberra and federal government buildings were given increased protection. Here's Laurie Oakes.
With the first news of the horrific events in New York and Washington, Australia's counter-terrorism plan swung into action. Intelligence and security experts working through the night, reporting to Acting Prime Minister John Anderson at 7 a.m.
We've not seen anything like this. The scale of it, the meticulous planning of it.
Mr Anderson spoke to Mr Howard in Washington, then arranged a phone hookup of cabinet ministers. And when it came to the question of whether to support retaliation by the US, Australia's political leaders did not hesitate.
We will help them. We will support actions they take to properly retaliate in relation to these acts of bastardry against their citizens and against what they stand for.
Acts of evil like this cannot go unpunished. You commit an act of war and you apply to it deadly force, you receive deadly force in return.
If the United States establishes who's responsible and they decide to deal strongly with those people, we'll support that.
Well before dawn, new security arrangements were being put in place. The US Embassy in Canberra was locked down, extra police and protective services guards brought in, an exclusion zone established around the complex. Everything stopped except the wildlife.
Well, X-ray it and make sure it's okay.
Protection was also stepped up at US consulates in Melbourne, Sydney and Perth, and special measures were taken to safeguard US warships in Australian ports.
On all the advice that we have, there are no concerns in respect of Australia's security situation.
Just the same, Parliament House in Canberra and other federal government buildings were put on special alert, and vigilance at airports was increased. Late this afternoon, at a special Canberra church service for the victims of the terrorist attacks, Governor-General Peter Hollingworth spoke on behalf of all Australians.
To the American people, we say, we stand beside you today in your grief, in your horror, in your moral outrage.
Laurie Oakes, National 9 News.
The hunt for the terrorists who orchestrated the attacks will be one of the most intensive security operations the world has seen. And as investigations centre on the Middle East and the Islamic fundamentalists who wage war on the United States, one man has emerged as the prime suspect. Simon Boder explains.
A sharp contrast to the shock and disbelief in the West. In the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, Palestinians were celebrating, showering children with lollies in a macabre show of triumph. In the early confusion, a Palestinian splinter group appeared to claim responsibility. That was quickly withdrawn, and it became clear that many in the Arab world wanted to distance themselves from the atrocity.
We are completely shocked. Completely shocked. Unbelievable.
The finger of blame is already pointing at this man, Saudi warlord Osama bin Laden, a billionaire. He's the world's most wanted and ruthless terrorist. He's said to be one of the few people in the world capable of such evil. Thought to operate from Afghanistan, he's sheltered by the ruling Taliban, who deny he was involved. Middle East observers are not convinced.
Bin Laden declared clearly 5 years ago that he will attack American interests and American embassies and American troops in the Middle East.
Bin Laden is already implicated in some of the worst terrorist attacks on the US, the 19
confidence that a very
in Africa, a suicide mission on the USS Cole just last year, and the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. For a time, it seemed that the US was launching a retaliatory strike with explosions clearly visible in the Afghan capital, Kabul. Washington denied taking action. It later emerged that anti-Taliban forces were responsible. Whatever the evidence against bin Laden, the United States has many enemies, among them Colonel Gaddafi of Libya and Iraq's Saddam Hussein. Iraqi TV said the attacks were the fruit of American crimes against humanity. Israel's leaders are sobered as never before.
At this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people.
Israel has closed its borders to foreign planes and declared a day of mourning.
It's clear that the world will not be the same place to live in from now on.
The fear now across this region is when and where retribution will come. Simon Boda, National 9 News.
World leaders have expressed their sorrow as shockwaves from the attacks on the US are felt around the globe. In London, thousands of office workers fled their buildings, fearing the terrorists would strike there. This report from Damien Ryan.
The building at the heart of London's financial district was not officially evacuated, but most people chose to leave anyway. The skyscraper in Canary Wharf emptied. So too did the headquarters of the London Stock Exchange, while other landmarks were closed as a security precaution.
It was a somewhat surreal afternoon in that we could see that all was going on, and then basically someone came round and said, right, everybody out.
Many workers had colleagues based in New York's Twin Towers.
To think that those people that certainly I knew in New York have collapsed along with the building is very difficult to comprehend.
We know people in those buildings, so I just think it's terrible.
It was early afternoon in London when news of the attack came through. Across the city, people stopped to watch the full horror played out on television. For years, the City of London has lived in the shadow of terrorism from the IRA. After today's events, it's now clear that threat may come from further afield. With the United States virtually sealed off, transatlantic flights were cancelled. Those en route were either diverted to Canada or forced to turn back.
The pilot came on and said, you may be aware that we've been circling, we're in a holding pattern. We are unable to enter international airspace.
Prime Minister Tony Blair rushed to Downing Street to convene a crisis meeting of the government's emergency committee, which was quick to raise security to its highest level.
Flight paths into London have been changed so there will be no civil overflights of central London. Security has been increased across the full range of government buildings and military premises.
And on the streets, it was clearly visible, the familiar ring of steel once again protecting the capital. US embassies both here and on the continent have been the focus of most attention. All have been given permission to close. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin sent his condolences to the United States. French President Chirac expressed his outrage. There's no containing emotions. Across Europe, the grieving has begun.
And Damien Ryan joins us now from London. Damien, security in the world's major capitals has been tightened. What steps are the British taking?
The City of London is currently on amber alert. That's 1 grade short of red, the official war footing. On the streets, extra police are clearly visible. Officers from outside the city have been drafted in to help in the security operation. As we speak, Prime Minister Tony Blair is convening yet another emergency meeting of his key advisers. Mr Blair has already stated that the United Kingdom stands shoulder to shoulder with the United States, so it's highly likely any retaliatory strike mounted by America will have some British involvement. Back to the studio.
Thanks, Damien. The shockwaves over the terrorist attacks have been felt on the Australian share market, which plunged into the red, but the markets are expected to recover. Brett McLeod with the latest.
With the US markets closed by the terrorist attacks, it took only a few minutes to see the financial impact in Australia. A sea of red indicating major sell-offs, particularly in insurance and tourism.
Clearly, it's the airline stocks such as Qantas and Flight Centre, for example, have been affected.
But as happens in times of world crisis, some stocks benefited.
It's the safe haven areas such as the gold mining sector.
Moms and dads, friends and neighbours.
After viewing the tragic offence, Premier Steve Bracks has ordered all government buildings to fly flags at half-mast.
In regard to those people who have suffered from this senseless and useless act.
The Lord Mayor signed letters of condolence to his counterparts in New York and Washington, as the city was stunned by events on the other side of the world.
Disbelief, and how can it happen?
Beyond comprehension.
Some were coping with grief a long way from home.
We just hugged our Kiwi and Australian friends, and they're very understanding and they know how we feel.
Many Melburnians, like the rest of the world, found traditional ways of coming to terms with the appalling events in the United States. Parishioners have been filing into churches throughout the day to pray for the many who've suffered.
Strength for those who suffer from these evils, especially today's strength for those in New York and in Washington.
Brett McLeod, National 9 News.
On top of the human tragedy, the destruction of the World Trade Center is a serious setback for shopping centre king Frank Lowy. He has a 99-year lease on the retail sector of the complex, which is now buried under rubble. Anna Corrin has that story.
Earlier this year, Westfield chairman Frank Lowy won the rights to lease 400,000 square metres of retail space in the World Trade Center. The $260 million upfront investment considered the jewel in the crown of Westfield's US portfolio. But the destruction of the Twin Towers saw the prices of Westfield Holdings and Westfield America Trust dramatically fall, down by up to 9% at one stage.
Quite a significant negative impact on confidence and morale. It's absolutely a terrible tragedy what has happened.
Of the 10 Westfield employees inside the building, one male American staff member remains unaccounted for. Investors can take some comfort. The property and income stream were insured against acts of terrorism. While the loss of the World Trade Center asset is a major blow to the Westfield business, analysts predict it won't have a significant impact in the long term.
Westfield, as I say, have a very long history of being successful in what they do, and I'm sure we should have confidence that they'll get the job done.
It's believed Westfield will continue pursuing opportunities in the US. 2 weeks ago, announcing an investment in rival mall owner Rodamco North America, with the aim of taking over this company and its 40 shopping centres. Anna Corrin, National 9 News.
Former US President Bill Clinton is in North Queensland in the tourist town of Port Douglas. He's believed to have cancelled the rest of his private holiday and is now subject to the tightest security. Carl Stefanovic reports.
Only hours before the attack, Bill Clinton was out and about enjoying the Port Douglas sunshine before boarding a boat for a private tour of the Great Barrier Reef.
We're going to have a couple of great days here.
Later, Mr. Clinton dined at a local restaurant before receiving the phone call that changed everything.
What do you think was going through his mind,
Once that call? Oh, mate, total devastation like the rest of us in Australia.
He retreated to his hotel room amid the tightest of security and hasn't been seen since. Queensland police reinforcements arrived at the hotel throughout the night, concerned the former US president could be another target.
Obviously, I can't go into the absolute details of it, but we're taking what we'd class as the normal precautions in a situation like this.
This morning, the resort was virtually deserted.
Has Mr. Clinton left yet?
I've no idea.
We have increased security for Mr. Clinton to a level where we are confident that he is safe and secure and will be safe and secure until he is able to leave this country.
Mr. Clinton was due to leave Cairns today, and while secrecy surrounds his movements, it may very well be that Port Douglas is the safest place for the former president.
He is safe. He'll obviously want to return to the United States as soon as possible, but I don't intend to indicate his travel plans. That would be quite wrong.
In Port Douglas, Carl Stefanovic, National 9 News.
The awful weight of the situation now rests on the shoulders of Mr. Clinton's successor, George W. Bush. It was a grim-faced president who addressed the nation from the Oval Office earlier today, vowing to avenge the shocking loss of life. This is what he had to say.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices. Secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
Now to the rest of the day's news, and Ansett Airlines is on the brink of collapse tonight after Qantas rejected proposals to take over parts of it.